Okay, ready to dive into this stack you sent me?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot to unpack.
Ron Paul, gold, the economy. It's a bit of a rabbit hole, right?
Yeah.
But always fascinating. This whole idea of money. Like, we all agree it's valuable, but is it really?
That's the core of Ron Paul's argument. He's coming at this with a huge critique of the entire U.S. monetary system.
And he's been pretty vocal about it for, well, decades, hasn't he?
Oh, yeah. He's been a consistent voice, even when those views were considered, let's say, outside the mainstream.
To put it mildly. But that's what we're here for. Expert, break it down for us. What's at the heart of Paul's argument?
He's basically saying that our system, which relies on what's called fiat currency, money, without inherent value, is leading us down a dangerous path.
Fiat currency. Okay, back up a second. For me, you're saying the dollar isn't actually backed by anything tangible. Like, I always assumed it was tied to gold reserves or something.
That's a common misconception. The U.S. dollar hasn't been directly backed by gold since the 1970s.
Wow, I did not realize that. So if it's not tied to something like gold, what's stopping the government from just printing more, I don't know, whenever they want?
Theoretically, nothing. And that's a major point of contention for Ron Paul. He argues that this ability to essentially create money out of thin air leads to inflation.
Right, inflation, that's where things start hitting everyone's wallets. But how does that work exactly? You print more money, things get more expensive. What's the connection there?
Think of it like this. Every new dollar that's created dilutes the value of all the dollars already in circulation.
Okay, I'm trying to visualize this.
Like slicing a pie. If you keep adding more slices, but the pie stays the same size, each piece gets smaller, right?
Yeah, makes sense. So with money, the more you print, the less each individual dollar is actually worth.
Exactly. Your purchasing power decreases. What you could buy yesterday with $1 might cost you more tomorrow. That's inflation in action.
And that's where the gold standard comes in, right?
Yeah.
I know Ron Paul is a big advocate for returning to a system where money is tied to gold.
He is. He sees it as a way to impose discipline on the system, to limit the government's ability to just print more money whenever it's convenient.
But wouldn't that make it harder to, say, respond to economic crises? If your hands are tied to a fixed amount of gold, wouldn't that limit your options?
That's one of the main criticisms leveled at the gold standard. Opponents argue that it lacks flexibility, that it could hinder economic growth.
So it's a trade-off. Stability for potentially less flexibility.
It's a balancing act for sure. And it's a debate that's been going on for centuries. There's no easy answer. But to understand Ron Paul's stance, we have to dig a bit deeper into his philosophy, particularly when it comes to savings.
Savings. How does that tie into all of this?
Well, if you know or suspect that the value of your money is constantly being eroded by inflation, what's the incentive to save?
That's a great point. Why would you hold on to something that's guaranteed to be worth less tomorrow than it is today?
Exactly. And Paul argues that this disincentive to save has real consequences for the economy as a whole. He's a big believer in individual responsibility and the importance of hard work.
Right. The idea that people should be rewarded for their labor, not for, say, speculating on Wall Street.
Exactly. He believes that people should work for their necessities and that whatever is left over should be saved or invested to fuel future growth.
But don't we need people spending money to keep the economy humming? What happens if everyone just stashes their cash under their mattresses?
It's all about balance. Savings are crucial because they provide the capital for investment. When people save less, there's less money available for businesses to borrow, expand, hire, all of that.
So if people are worried about inflation eating away at their savings, that can create this ripple effect that impacts the entire economy.
Exactly. And that's where Ron Paul points the finger at the Federal Reserve, often just called the Fed.
Ah, the Fed. They're always in the news. But what role do they play in all of this?
Paul argues that the Fed, with its ability to manipulate interest rates and influence the money supply, actually distorts the natural flow of the economy.
Hold on. Manipulate is a strong word.
And he uses it intentionally. He believes the Fed's interventions, while often well-intentioned, create more problems than they solve. For example, by creating credit.
Creating credit. How is that even possible?
It's complicated, but in simple terms, the Fed can buy things like government bonds. And they can do this with money that essentially doesn't exist yet. This injects new money into the economy.
So it's like giving the economy a shot of adrenaline. But like any stimulant, there are always side effects, right?
Precisely. Paul would argue that these interventions, while they might provide a short-term boost, ultimately lead to longer-term problems like inflation. And he has a term for the kind of credit the Fed creates. He calls it fraudulent credit.
Fraudulent credit. That sounds ominous.
He's not pulling any punches. He believes this easy money policy erodes the value of existing savings, disproportionately impacting those who are most vulnerable.
So it's like this hidden tax that we all pay, but might not even realize is happening.
That's the gist of it. And it's part of a larger pattern, according to Paul. He sees these policies as benefiting a select few at the expense of the many.
And that ties into his views on free markets, right? This idea that the government should be less involved in the economy, not more.
Exactly. But to fully understand those views, we need to look at one of the most contentious aspects of Ron Paul's platform, his stance on entitlement programs.
Yeah, entitlement programs, that's where things get really interesting. It's like this whole other layer of the economic pie, right?
Definitely. And it's a topic that Ron Paul doesn't shy away from. He's been very critical of these programs, particularly Social Security and Medicare.
And those are like the third rails of American politics, right?
Yeah.
You touch them at your own peril.
Exactly. But Paul argues that we can't afford to ignore the elephant in the room. He sees these programs as unsustainable in their current form.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little. What's his main critique of programs like Social Security and Medicare?
At the core, it's this idea of the entitlement mentality, as he calls it. He argues that these programs, while well-intentioned, create a culture of dependency and discourage personal responsibility.
So it's not that he doesn't see the need for a safety net, but he takes issue with how that safety net is structured.
Exactly. He believes the government has essentially made promises it can't keep, that these programs are on a collision course with financial reality.
And that's a scary thought for a lot of people, right? Especially those who rely on these programs for their livelihood, for their health care. That's not something you just mess with lightly.
Absolutely. And that's where the debate gets really heated. Critics argued that Paul's proposals would disproportionately hurt the most vulnerable members of society.
So if he's not advocating for just scrapping these programs entirely, what's his alternatives? What does he propose we do?
He's a big proponent of individual empowerment. He believes that people should have more control over their own retirement savings and healthcare decisions rather than relying solely on the government.
Okay, so more individual control, what does that look like in practice?
Well, he's talked about things like transitioning to a system of private retirement accounts, for example, where people have more direct ownership of their savings.
So instead of paying into a system that might not be there when they retire, they'd be investing in their own future.
Exactly. And he sees this as a way to incentivize savings and personal responsibility.
And what about healthcare? That's a huge issue, especially for seniors who rely on Medicare. What's his solution there?
He's a strong advocate for a more market-driven healthcare system. He believes that by introducing more competition, we can drive down costs and improve quality.
So less government regulation, more free market competition. It all ties back to his core philosophy, right?
Absolutely. It's all interconnected. But of course, these are complex issues with no easy answers, and there are valid arguments on both sides.
That's for sure. It seems like every solution comes with its own set of trade-offs.
Yeah.
But if we step back and look at the bigger picture, where does Ron Paul ultimately want to take us with all of this?
He wants a fundamental shift in how we think about money, government, and our role as individuals in society. He believes that a return to sound money, fiscal responsibility, and limited government is essential for a truly prosperous and free society.
So less government intervention, more individual liberty. That's the core message.
That's a big part of it, and while his views might seem radical to some, they definitely challenge us to rethink the status quo.
And that's always a good thing, right? To question our assumptions and explore new possibilities.
Absolutely. Even if you don't agree with everything Ron Paul says, he forces you to think critically about these fundamental issues that impact all of our lives.
And that's what this deep dive is all about, getting people to engage with these big ideas and form their own conclusions.
Exactly. It's about sparking curiosity, encouraging people to do their own research and become more informed citizens.
And maybe even challenge some of their own beliefs along the way. But to truly grasp the potential impact of Ron Paul's ideas, we need to explore what he sees as the ultimate stakes. He's issued some pretty stark warnings about the future of the U.S. economy, and it's not exactly a rosy picture. A stark warning that definitely got my attention. So what exactly does Ron Paul see on the horizon for the U.S. economy?
Well, he's been pretty blunt in his assessments. He believes that our current trajectory, the reliance on fiat currency, the massive debt, the unchecked growth of government, it's all leading us towards a major economic crisis.
A crisis? Like, how bad are we talking?
He's used terms like economic collapse and systemic failure. He sees it as an inevitable consequence of what he calls our unsound economic policies.
Those are some pretty strong words. But is he talking about something that could happen in the near future, or is this more of a long-term prediction?
That's the thing. No one can predict the future with absolute certainty. But Paul would argue that the warning signs are already flashing. He points to things like rising inflation, the ballooning national debt, and the increasing instability of the global financial system as evidence that the current path is unsustainable.
So it's like we're driving towards a cliff, and instead of hitting the brakes, we're just stepping on the gas.
That's one way to put it. And Paul's message is a wake-up call. He's saying, look, we can't just keep doing the same things and expect a different result. We need a course correction, and fast.
But is it even possible to change course at this point? I mean, we're talking about deeply ingrained systems and institutions. Can we really turn this ship around?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Paul believes it's possible, but it requires a fundamental shift in our thinking. He argues that we need to rediscover the principles of sound money, limited government, and individual responsibility that he believes were fundamental to America's early success.
So it's not just about tweaking the system here and there. It's about a more fundamental reevaluation of our priorities.
Exactly. He sees it as a battle of ideas. He wants to change the conversation to get people thinking differently about the role of government, the nature of money, and their own responsibilities as citizens.
That's a tall order. But let's say hypothetically that people buy into his message. What can the average person actually do? It can feel pretty overwhelming, right?
It's easy to feel powerless, but Paul would argue that every individual has a role to play. He often says, knowledge is power. The more people understand about how the system works, the more likely they are to demand better from their leaders.
So it starts with education, learning about economics, monetary policy, those kinds of things.
Exactly. And the good news is there's a wealth of information available these days. Books, articles, podcasts like this one. There are countless resources out there for people who want to learn more.
And beyond education, what else can people do to make a difference?
Get involved. Vote for candidates who share your values. Contact your elected officials. Support organizations that are working to promote sound economic policies. Every little bit helps.
So it's about becoming more informed, more engaged citizens, and using that knowledge to advocate for change.
Precisely. And never underestimate the power of individual action. Even small changes can have a ripple effect.
This has been a fascinating conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot, even if it's a bit daunting to think about the challenges ahead.
It's definitely a lot to process, but as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of Ron Paul, I think the key takeaway is this: the future isn't predetermined. We have a choice in how this story unfolds.
And that choice starts with understanding the issues and taking action.
Yeah.
So to our listeners out there, stay curious, stay informed, and most importantly, stay engaged.
Absolutely. And remember, the only way to create a better future is to be active participants in shaping it.
That's a great note to end on. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Be sure to check out the show notes for more information and resources on this important topic.
Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.